시작을 할까요? 예. Hello, good evening and good morning. Thank you for joining. I'm Hyosang Ahn, Vice President of Institute for Political and Economic Alternatives, an independent institute based on Seoul. We have seminar on half Earth socialism with one of its authors, Drew Pendergrass. I'd like to thank him for attending this event. This seminar was scheduled to be held in the middle of last September, but we had to postpone it due to the family occasion of Drew Pendergrass. Finally, today we have the seminar online. I'm going to talk about the structure of seminar. At the start, Professor Kang Min-hyung will introduce Drew Pendergrass. Professor Kang has played an important role of organizing the seminar as a bridge between Drew Pendergrass and my institute. I'd like also thank him. And then Drew Pendergrass will speak about today's subject, half Earth socialism, in 45 minutes. That's okay? Yeah, okay. After his presentation, I will give some comments and questions in 10 minutes. And then we'll have break for 10 minutes. After that, free discussion will be held. That's all. Professor Kang, would you introduce Drew Pendergrass to us?
Sure. So let me explain him in Korean and then I will summarize it in English. Okay. So, 네, 오늘 감사드리고요. 드류 펜더그라스는 지구의 절반 사회주의 공저자이고요. 현재 미국 하버드대학교 환경공학 박사과정에 재학 중입니다. 그는 대기화학과 미세먼지를 연구하는 환경공학자이고요. 주로 대기에 관한 슈퍼컴퓨터 모델링을 보정하고 이를 위해서 위성, 항공기, 지표면 관측 등을 활용하고 있습니다. 사실 환경공학자로서의 연구보다는 오늘 저희는 그의 환경에 관한 여러 사회과학적인 그리고 역사적인 글에 대해서 보려고 하고요. 이미 그의 글은 하퍼 매거진, 가디언, 자코뱅 등에 출간되었습니다. 오늘 발표한 책과 관련해서는 자연의 인간화와 지구의 절반 사회주의라는 제목의 영어 논문을 2021년에 International Labor and Working Class History라는 사회사 관련 저널에 출간하기도 했습니다. So Drew Pendergrass is a PhD student in environmental engineering at Harvard University, and he is the co-author of the book titled Half Earth Socialism, which is translated in Korean this year. So please welcome Drew Pendergrass with applause.
Thank you all for having me. This is wonderful to get to speak to you. I'm sorry it's on Zoom and not in person, but I'm glad that we can meet in some form. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Great. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about this book, Half Earth Socialism. A little bit about myself. I think, Professor Kang did a great job introducing me, but I am both a scientist and a writer. On the left-hand side, I'm showing the sort of work that I do in my scientific career. I use satellite data, and I look at reports of emissions to the UN, and I use the satellites to correct emissions reports. So my goal is to build real-time systems that can measure emissions of various pollutants. And in this book, talk about a lot of things, but among them is this idea of using some of these information systems for a form of planetary governance, which I'll get into over the course of the presentation. So the book is in 4 chapters. I'll be mostly talking about these middle 2, which are mostly getting into a critique of existing environmentalism and then some possible utopian mode solutions. And when I use the word utopia, I mean it in a good way. And I'll explain a little bit about why that is. So today I'll be talking about 4 things on these subjects. I'll be talking about the decarbonization challenge and the challenge of environmental crisis. I'll be talking a little bit about a concept from climate science called hysteresis. I'll define that. And then I'll use these kind of physical science motivations to get into some philosophical questions and economic questions, like this dichotomy between planning nature or planning the economy, and how that leads us to a new socialist calculation debate. So I'll just get into it. So this is a graph that shows the share of energy consumption by source for the entire world. You can see that the top 3 lines are oil, coal, and gas. Gas is slowly going up as coal is sort of phasing out in different parts of the world. We do have some renewables, or at least low carbon sources, down at the bottom here, and they are increasing very rapidly. Solar energy has increased by many orders of magnitude since 2010, but it's still only a fraction of the world's energy use. Now, one reason why this is that this energy consumption includes everything, not just electricity. Electricity is only a relatively small amount of our energy use. A lot of our energy use is directly applied to things like a factory. If you're making coal, you're directly burning a fuel to make steel. Or if you're driving a car, a gas-powered car, you're directly burning the fuels there. So in the US, I'm looking at our greenhouse gas emissions, and the vast majority of our greenhouse gas emissions in the US come from industry, so things like making steel, transportation, and buildings, like heating and cooling of buildings, and then a few other sources, including agriculture. Only a relatively small amount of our emissions come from electricity. So electric power is about a quarter of our greenhouse gas emissions in the US. Korea is relatively similar, although Korea is a bit more heavily industrialized relative to the average person than the US is. So in the game of decarbonization, the goal is basically to put everything onto the electrical grid where we have very good technologies. We have solar power, we have wind power, we have these great decarbonized energy sources. If we can get everything like, making steel, driving onto this grid, then you've to some degree solved the carbon emissions crisis. This is because you can make the grid clean. You can use grid scale solutions like giant batteries, that sort of thing. And you can then have end uses be dependent on this grid. So in the US, we have about 20,000 electrical generators on the grid. The game is change each one, right? Like change each of these generators to something renewable. Easier said than done, right? But that's sort of the challenge. Now, this is the way it's conventionally framed. This is the conventional framing of the challenge of decarbonization. And I basically agree with it, but I want to point out a few reasons why this is hard. It's not just a matter of changing out generators or something. It's actually the fact that fossil fuels do very useful things that are hard to replace. So, for example, take flights, take airplanes. Airplanes require very certain kinds of fuel that are very high in energy density. This is because the fuel can't be very heavy, right? You need to have the plane be able to fly. So you need to have very energy dense fuel. So this normally comes from very highly refined fossil fuels. Now you could power a plane with a synthetic fuel. The idea would be use electricity to make fuel from the air. You take CO2 out of the air, you turn it into a fuel, and then you burn it and you get the CO2 back. So it's net neutral, right? You just got the CO2 out of the air, you burn it to get CO2 back into the air, you get to fly with no carbon emissions. This would be wonderful. The problem is that this is an inefficient use of electricity. So this is a calculation that was done by some people at Carbon Briefing. And the idea is that if you go to the UK and you replace all the flights just in and out of the UK with e-fuels, which is the most plausible drop-in replacement for jet fuel, it would take about 2 times the entire current electricity generation of the UK to just power the planes alone. So as in you would need to generate a lot more electricity to fuel all these planes. And this is just for the planes. You would also have to generate, renewable electricity for everything else too. So what I'm trying to get at here is that putting everything onto the grid is not easy, right? Because we have these energy systems like planes that require very specific kinds of fuels that are hard to replace, which isn't to say that we shouldn't replace them. We should replace them, but that it's not so easy to just keep going as before. There's another solution. The other solution is to get fuels from plants, right? So plants are making carbon, right? Like they do something like fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are mostly fossilized plants, right? So there is a way that you can use some biofuels to make jet fuel. The problem is that plants, they're basically solar powered, right? They require energy from the sun to grow. And you would need up to 2/3 of all the cropland in the UK to grow enough plants to fly the planes. So in other words, biofuels are a way to power things with relatively green energy, but they require you to sacrifice land. So you either have to sacrifice a lot of electricity for an inefficient way to get something on the grid, or you sacrifice land to get biofuels. This also applies to things like plastic. You can make plastic from plants too, but again, it requires this land use problem. So this is a very confusing plot, but I'm just going to walk you through it briefly. This is from an IPCC assessment report of climate change. This was from about 5 years ago. This is from the report on limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial times. And what each of these plots show is a pathway to achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius of carbon emissions. And these pathways depend on how rapidly you phase out fossil fuels. So if you simply, so each of these scenarios from LED to S5 is just different levels of phasing out fossil fuels. LED is low electricity demand. So it's a scenario where we reduce electricity demand by things like both efficiency improvements, but also restricting energy use. Maybe we would ban certain forms of energy use. Now, if you have low energy demand, you're basically able to cut emissions relatively quickly and get down to your climate goals without what are called negative emissions technologies. Now, time has passed since this agreement, this report, so this is now a harder pathway than it was. But anyway, that's the idea, and that's sort of what we advocate in our book, and I'll get into that in a little more detail. As these scenarios increase in number from 1 to 5, it's slower fossil fuel energy phase out. So we're still burning fossil fuels well into the 2050s, 2060s. And instead we use this little yellow blob here. So this yellow color is a lot of negative emissions. So you can see that each of these colors, they're the emission sources, and then yellow is a negative emission source. This is from something called bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration, BECCS. The idea with BECCS is that you grow a plantation of trees. The trees take carbon into them as they grow. You burn the trees for electricity, but you capture the carbon that the trees emit and bury it underground. So the idea is that it's a net negative source of energy. So we can generate electricity while removing carbon from the atmosphere. This is a very popular proposal in models because you can get electricity while removing carbon from the atmosphere. The problem is that it takes a lot of land to do this. So in the scenario S5, which is the slow phase out scenario where we keep using fossil fuels for a long time, we need to take about 3 Indias worth of land and turn them into these plantations of trees. So it's a major land hungry solution. So in other words, there's this problem of fuels, this problem of like planes, of steel that might require biofuels. And then there's the problem of removing the carbon that is already in the atmosphere. So there's a lot of carbon that we've already emitted. We'd like it to come down, but that might also require land. Now, what do we use land for currently? Well, about half of the habitable land on Earth is used for agriculture. And of that land used for agriculture, 3/4 is used for livestock. So there is a major, maybe you could think of it as an inefficiency in the way we use land, in that a large portion of land is used for livestock when it could be used for other sources, especially when you think about the fact that a lot of the land for livestock is growing plants to feed to the animals, right? We grow soybeans. The majority of soybeans are fed to pigs and chickens. The majority of corn is fed to cows, right? Or the plurality, I should say. So a large amount of these crops go to animals. So you could imagine freeing up some of this land for other uses. One other thing to think about in terms of land and land scarcity is mass extinction. So our book is named Half Earth, Socialism. And the idea of the half Earth comes from E.O. Wilson, who is a biologist, conservation biologist. And the argument that he makes based on empirical mathematical studies is that the extinction rate goes like the fourth root of land area. In other words, as you preserve more land area, you can preserve more biodiversity. This is based on his study of islands. So islands, as an island gets bigger, it can support more species, more biodiversity. And the argument is that if you preserve half of the Earth, then you can prevent 85% of mass extinctions. Whereas if you preserve 10% of the Earth, you'll get something like 85% of species going extinct. So there's a trade-off between land preservation and biodiversity loss. So I've said a lot of things just now, so I just want to summarize it. Most energy consumption comes from burning fuels directly, not electricity. So to decarbonize, we have to replace fuels with low carbon biofuels. So we make fuels from plants, and or we electrify everything and put it on the grid. Moreover, to capture extra carbon in the atmosphere, we have to either sacrifice land for BECCS, so this technology where we grow trees and then burn them, or there are forms of rewilding, like if you just turn land into a biodiverse area of nature, that itself sucks carbon out of the atmosphere, which is very powerful. Or you can actually use electricity to capture carbon from the atmosphere, but that's really, really electricity intensive. All this is to say that all these constraints of getting rid of fossil fuels, which are extremely useful and convenient sources of energy, place constraints on how much energy we can consume. So we may not be able to consume as much final energy after this transition, right? Because fossil fuels are hard to replace. That's the argument. And this is a politically challenging argument, as you might imagine, because people, at least in relatively wealthy nations, are used to consuming a lot of electricity. So this is sort of our starting point in our book, right? This is so one way that you could get around with less energy use is a proposal like the 2,000 watt society. So this is a proposal that comes out of Switzerland, and the 2,000 watts corresponds to about this 17,000 kilowatt hours on this graph. I don't know if you use this unit. This is an American way that electricity is built. So it's about this little orange color. So you can see that, us in the US and Canada and Europe and much of East Asia, Russia, South Korea, we use way more energy than this quota. However, this quota is the same as the per capita energy use in the US in the 1960s. So it's not so terrible, right? It's just using less electricity, right? And the standard of living in the US in the 1960s wasn't bad on average, right? I mean, there's plenty of people who were treated badly, but I'm just talking here about electricity use, not about all the social issues. So here's our political challenge, is that maybe we need to cut energy use to make this energy transition happen. So before I go into some politics, I want to talk a little bit more about this physical science side of hysteresis. So what is a hysteresis? A hysteresis refers to, in a chaotic, nonlinear dynamical system, a pathway that diverges. In other words, as we emit carbon dioxide and increase the temperature of the Earth, we might go over a tipping point And then if we were able to get CO2 back down, things would be different. So for example, if the Greenland-Iceland sheet collapses, so all the ice of Greenland starts to melt very, very rapidly. If we were to cool the climate back down, the ice would not come back. We would have to cool the Earth down back to an ice age for the ice to come back. So a hysteresis is an irreversible change, or at least irreversible on the timescale of tens of thousands of years, which is a timescale that, for our purposes as human civilization, that should be considered irreversible. So here are some climate tipping points. These are often talked about in the context of climate change, but this is sort of why it's concerning, is that they can't be undone. So things like rainforest dieback. Once the rainforest in the Amazon dies back, it will transition to a savanna ecosystem, and that's a new equilibrium. It's a new stability. It's a new stable point. You won't get the rainforest back. And there are several numbers of these tipping points, and they're color-coded on the bottom here with the warming threshold. So some tipping points happen at 2 degrees Celsius of warming, which we're going to get to pretty quickly. And then others come at higher levels, but there are uncertainties. And these tipping points also speed up warming. So once the Greenland ice sheet collapses, if that were to happen, it would warm up the planet by quite a lot. So it would push us maybe towards more tipping points. So here's an example of a tipping point. This is a more theoretical tipping point. It's, I think, relatively unlikely to happen. But I like it because it's an example of this was probably important 30 million years ago in Earth's history. The idea is as CO2 increases, there's a lot of clouds in the tropics. You know, this is called the stratocumulus cloud deck. It covers most of the tropics at all the times, which is why it's cloudy in warm areas. If you get a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, these clouds disappear. But clouds are very white. They reflect solar radiation back into space. And if you lose your clouds, you heat up the Earth quite a lot. So this is something that probably was why the Earth was so hot 30 million years ago, which is it's called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. It's a climate mystery. But this might be a reason why. So hysteresis is this sort of change where, you know, we get this the clouds go away, and as we remove CO2 from the atmosphere, we go on this blue line, and the clouds are still gone, right? It's only when we get back to really low CO2 levels that the clouds return. So this is sort of the dynamics of a climate tipping point. All this is to say is that it sort of inspired some political thinking. So there's this idea of governing the Earth system. Can we govern the Earth system to avoid these tipping points and guide the system to a stable point? So this is a sort of a strange plot, but the idea is that as time comes towards us out of the screen, right? And we have these sort of stable points. The Earth has these stable positions where it can have a climate that behaves in a certain way. And as we are stewarding the Earth system, we've been going more and more towards this hothouse Earth scenario where we maybe melt a lot of ice sheets or something. And we have biosphere degradation, and eventually we might feed back into a state where we can't get out of it. We would be in a hothouse Earth state. However, we can steward the Earth system back towards a stable, you know, equilibrium. That's maybe different than it would be if there had been no capitalism, no humans, but it's certainly preferable to this hothouse Earth scenario. And then just before I go into some politics, I just want to say that it's not just about climate change. There's many other environmental crises that are all correlated. So things like I've talked a little bit about biodiversity loss. We're living in the 6th mass extinction in Earth's history. But there are also things like freshwater change, land use change, and then these flows of phosphorus and nitrogen from fertilizer into the oceans. They cause things like eutrophication, algae blooms. All these issues are really important. So now let's go into what we do with this politically. So this is the idea of planning nature or planning the economy. There's this idea of geoengineering. The idea of geoengineering is that we're going to deliberately modify the Earth's climate system in order to change it, in order to limit the impacts of climate change. So there are several ways to do this. The way that is kind of getting the most funding, the most traction, and I think is the most likely to happen, is solar radiation management. The idea of solar radiation management, it's shown by this plane in the top here, is that you spray particles, you spray sulfur dioxide largely, but there are other proposals, into the stratosphere, and it turns into particles which block out part of the sun. It's sort of like, you put Beijing up in the stratosphere, and you block out the sun, it cools down the earth. And this doubtless would happen. It's certain that if you were to spray these particles into the stratosphere, you would cool down the earth. But it would also cause a lot of unknown effects. Things like disrupting the monsoon. It would cause the sky to become white rather than blue. It would do all sorts of things that we can't quite predict because our knowledge of the atmosphere is very uncertain, right? We have an uncertain system. The system behaves in all these chaotic ways. And whenever we've done things that we thought would have no impact, they often have large impact. So the ozone hole was caused by these pollutants called chlorofluorocarbons that were supposed to be entirely unreactive. But in fact, in the stratosphere, they did react and they destroyed ozone very, very efficiently. So the lesson of the ozone hole is that the atmosphere and nature behave in very unpredictable ways, right? And maybe this geoengineering proposal is not so wise. The example we use in the book is Biosphere 2. Biosphere 2 was an experiment in Arizona in the US in the 1980s and 90s. The idea was to build a system that artificially creates nature. So we're going to, inside this building, we're going to completely seal it off. There's no oxygen coming in. There's no air coming in. We're going to use plants to make the air. And it's going to be like in space. So this is a simulation of going to space and living in a colony that makes its own air, its own food, its own water. And so they locked some people in for 2 years. And it did not go well. Very quickly, everything died. There were a lot of environmental crises that happened in miniature. They had pollinator loss, which is what we have. They had mass extinction. They had invasive species. They had eutrophication, so like algae blooms, which ruined the water. They also had some unique things that happened to them that wouldn't happen to us, like the oxygen reacted with the concrete, so they lost oxygen. That's not something that would happen to us, but it's an excellent example of an unforeseen consequence when intervening in a system as complex as nature. So Biosphere 2 was a disaster. And I think the lessons that some people have taken in the journal Science was basically that, we've learned a lot. We know a lot more about nature and about the earth than we used to, but we still don't know enough to control it, right? There's a difference between learning enough to understand and learning enough to control. Controlling requires a much deeper level of knowledge than action. And our gambit in the book is that although something like controlling the economy, planning the economy is hard, right? It's certainly not easy to plan the economy. Our argument is basically that it's easier than planning nature. People like Friedrich Hayek, these people who really say that planning the economy is impossible, they use metaphors of nature, right, to explain why the economy is impossible. They're like, the economy is like nature, and you wouldn't want to control nature, would you? Right? So we use the same argument to out-Hayek, as we say in the book, and basically be like, well, if you are analogizing the economy to nature, how much more foolish is it to try and control nature in order to let the economy do what it does, right? Instead, maybe we should restrain our own actions as humans. Maybe we should move past this capital-driven mode of accumulation, this capitalist system, and control the economy ourselves to limit the damage on nature. Now, this isn't just an argument, an intellectual argument, but I think it's hopefully interesting. So that brings me into my last portion of the talk, which is this socialist calculation problem. So the socialist calculation debate was a debate over the possibility of planning the economy. It began in the late 1910s into 1920s, although there's essays before that are often included in the history. But it really starts with this man on the left, Otto Neurath. Otto Neurath was a philosopher. Today, he's most read by philosophers of science for his some of his ideas, and he's also read by designers, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But he was a planner involved in the Bavarian Social Republic during the German Civil War, 1918-1919. So Otto Neurath, he was the head planner. So they were trying to run, this new society without markets. And he writes these essays about planning in natura. So his idea is that rather than planning using money, we should plan using natural units. So, how much steel do we need? How much, road do we need? And we can use this to actually plan what we're going to do. And that economic democracy is going to be key to this. So we need to all be voting on, what our proposals are. And the way he thought voting should work in the economy is through scientific utopias. So the idea of a scientific utopia is that different people, maybe different political parties, would propose concrete plans for the future that are very detailed. So it's a scientific utopia. It's like a blueprint. It says we want to build this much track with this much steel because we want public transportation to connect all these different places in Bavaria, for example. And the reason why he liked this scientific utopia idea is because it captures the fact that certain debates are incommensurable. Like if I want public transportation and someone else wants private cars and transportation, it's hard to do both at the same time well, right? You might want to imagine like a really dense public transit network might require fewer cars, right? So there's conflict, right? And what Neurath really liked about this idea of scientific utopia is that it makes the conflict clear, and then we can take a coherent course of action after debate and voting. Now, he's not entirely detailed about how this might work in practice, which is where this man on the right, Ludwig von Mises, comes in. So Mises is a famous neoliberal. He's one of the founders of neoliberalism, a conservative philosopher and economist. And he critiques Otto Neurath's idea. And he says that actually you can't plan without markets. The reason why is that markets are able to produce these intermediate prices that help you decide what to do with intermediate goods. What that means is without markets, Mises says, if you have a bar of steel, it's impossible to know whether it's better to put it into a skyscraper or into like a wind turbine, right? What do you do with this material that could be anything? What do you do with investment? How do you decide what to do? Is there any sort of way to work through scarcity? And to Mises, the only way to work through scarcity is through markets. Markets determine what you're supposed to do with these different goods, right? And this kind of is how the socialist calculation debate in its first round goes. Is people like Abel Lerner, Oscar Longa, these famous socialists kind of take Mises' argument to heart. But I want to follow this Neurath's thread. Otto Neurath his career continues after the fall of the Bavarian Soviet, and he starts working with this picture language called isotype. The idea of isotype is to make it so that people who can't read, like people who are illiterate, can participate in planning of the economy. The idea is using these images, pictograms, to show the economy. And the idea is that if you can show the economy, if you can understand the economy, then you can control it, right? If ordinary people can understand, the amount of steel that has to go through, the amount of electricity, then it becomes something that can be politically contested and that people can imagine they can control. So his end of his career was spent in museums doing these sorts of displays. So, so this is this legacy of Otto Neurath, is this idea of this sort of sense that we could plan, we could have economic democracy, and we can have these ways of giving people like a dashboard to see how the economy works. But it's still not quite worked out in detail. Then there's this man named Leonid Kantorovich. Kantorovich was a Soviet mathematician. He was involved on the left here with the defense of Leningrad during World War II. And what he did was he would manage basically the convoys of supplies that would be relieving the siege of Leningrad and let people live and evacuate people from the city. And Kantorovich, during this war, was working on this math called linear programming. Linear programming is a way of optimizing a system of equations constrained by inequalities. So this is used all the time if you're in the business world or if you're in electricity planning. Like, this algorithm is used all over the place. It's basically like, we want, if you're a corporation, maybe you ask, I want to maximize profits while minimizing the number of people I employ. That's the sort of thing you could use linear programming for. But Leonid Kontorovich was a Soviet scientist, and he wanted to use it to improve the Soviet planning system. He wanted to use it to get rid of waste, to get rid of basically bureaucratic intransigence. He wanted to, rationalize how a lot of these factories worked in the Soviet Union. And in fact, some people took up his call. So in Hungary, this man on the right here, his name is János Kornai. He was a planner in the Hungarian economy, and he built a computer system to plan the Hungarian economy. The idea is, so, in the 60s, where these computers were huge, they required magnetic tape, they needed to be programmed with punch cards. He was able to program a computer with about 200 people working with him that would basically take into account about 3,000 economic variables and optimize them to make a plan. So it would be used to make the 5-year plans, right? What they found was that they actually improved the official program by quite a bit. So their computer program was able to get savings of quite a lot of foreign investment, about manpower, all these different things that the socialist economy in Hungary required. They were able to get savings on with this program that they actually developed. So linear programming really was used to try and improve socialist economies in the 60s and 70s, at least until things cracked down and there was a sort of a reassertion of a conservative rule in the 70s under the Brezhnev era. But the important thing is that there were prototypes of this linear programming method. So why didn't it work? It didn't work for a couple of reasons. One reason is information incentive problems. So, for example, in the case with Kornai, what he found was that the different state-owned enterprises were happy to send him data as long as he was just experimenting. So when he was just playing with the computer to play with plans, people were able to, these state-owned industries would send him all the data that he needed. As soon as it became clear that this might actually be used to plan, people started to lie and misrepresent in order to try and make the plan easier for them to meet. So as soon as the plan seemed like it might happen, the incentives changed. And the people who ran these enterprises started misrepresenting their data in order to get an easier plan. Right? So there's this problem of information incentives. And then there's also the problem of politics, which is that this algorithm was a threat to a major source of power in the Eastern Bloc, which was the power of the planner, the power of Gosplan or other analogous planning agencies. Controlling the economy is a massive source of power, right? If you control where the factories are, where the workers go, that's power. You don't want to lose that to an algorithm. So there was a lot of political reason why this reform period didn't work. And so what's really interesting about this and what we use in the book is we try and take the lessons of this failure and we try and use it in service of Otto Neurath's original vision of economic democracy. So how can we take this sort of experiment from the 60s and 70s in the Eastern Bloc and use it to in service of this original vision of, a democratic debate among scientific utopias? But the story's not quite over yet, because the scientists who were involved in trying to reform the Soviet economy, they were eventually shut down. They weren't allowed to try and critique the economy. They weren't allowed to try and reform it. And what did many of them do? This is true. They became climate scientists. I'm not making this up. Many of these economists, they became some of the first programmers of global circulation models, which are climate models. So they turned their computer resources. This is the same computer centers that were doing these attempts to reform the economy. They started running these giant simulations. And what they did was they tried to critique nuclear combat, nuclear war. This is where the idea of nuclear winter comes from. The idea where, if you blow up nuclear weapons, the whole earth will become frozen. that idea comes from this period of the 1980s, collaborations between Eastern scientists and Western scientists on nuclear winter papers. So these these people who wanted to build this global, cybernetic economy, they ended up starting to think about the climate system. And so what we try and do a little bit in the book is go back again, right? A lot of climate science has built the sort of tools that we might want to use for planetary governance, right? So there are some people that I work with in my day job who are using satellites to measure things like leaks of methane from pipelines, right? And they can identify sites that are misbehaving, right? Like this is an illegal leak, right? They weren't supposed to eject this methane, but they did. And so we can identify this site and we know that they acted illegally. And there are these systems from the UN that are designed to do things like monitor methane. So in other words, climate science and atmospheric science are developing the sort of tools that we might want to use to help govern the economy, to help govern society and navigate it back towards this stable Earth. So I'm nearly done here, but in the book, we take a little bit of inspiration from Project CyberSim, another example of these utopian proposals for computer governance. This is from Chile in the 1970s under the presidentship of Salvador Allende. And the idea was we use this computer system to help us in service of democracy, right? The idea was that we have this inputs of facts about the economy, and we can use this to help intervene in emergencies and govern the economy in a way without the overwhelming influence of markets, right? And so there's all these experiments of like these possibilities of ways to use planning to get past this economic crisis and do things like navigate these very hard political challenges of like cutting energy use and envisioning like a possible society where we do cut energy use and we're able to navigate our planet away from catastrophe. So this will take a lot of updates from these experiments in the 60s and 70s. But the good news is that we have a lot of new science, right? We have a lot of new methods. We have a lot of new algorithms that we can use. But it's not just about algorithms, not just about methods. It's also about democracy. So the idea that are really coming into the climate movement are ideas of citizen assemblies, this idea of direct democracy. My co-author and I are working on a book about democracy now, about specifically CLR James's model of economic democracy. So the idea of, sortition, modeled on ancient Greece, people participating in the governance of the economy in the day-to-day life. So we really want to both take into account these new methods, new algorithms that can be used to replace the role of the market, but also new institutions of democracy that can be used to govern those algorithms and prevent any sort of technocracy from emerging. So I've given you a lot to think about. That's my talk, and we can have a discussion.
Thank you. Now it's my turn. Yeah, okay. Thank you for your brilliant presentation. I think the book is a significant effort considering the crises we face as well as the various proposals present to challenge them under the label of eco-socialism. We witnessed the situation in which so many analyses and solutions that could be classified as eco-socialist program have been put out during and after coronavirus pandemic. From Max Eyre, who intervened in the U.S. Green New Deal debate from an anti-imperialist perspective and argued for eco-socialism as a People's Green New Deal, to Andreas Malm's radical or somewhat occult argument for eco-Leninism and ecological war communism, to move beyond the chronic emergency, and to Nancy Fraser's carnival capitalism, an expanded view of capitalism not as an economic system but as an institutionalized social order that identifies not only the environmental crisis but also the crisis of social reproduction and the politics and expropriation of the outsides of capitalism, and offers eco-socialism as an alternative. And then Japanese scholar Koei Saito's rereading of Marx's political economy to rescue Marx's ecology and argue for ecological Marxism, and by extension, degrowth ecological communism. To the latest, Chantal Mouffe's Green Democratic Revolution, which regards socialism as a radicalization of democracy and project it onto climate politics. But I think your book's greatest strength is that it creates a blueprint for a future society, half Earth socialism, drawing on the utopian tradition. Importantly, it designs a future society based on the physical composition of the global economic metabolism. At a time when the questions of what is possible and how to do it are as important as what we should do, Harvard socialism answers them in terms of the physical conditions of human life. There are so many issues and arguments in the book for those who face seriously the problems of our time and seek to find a concrete solution. I'd like to thank the authors for preparing the rich, full course meal. But I'll raise a few problems that I feel are significant considering the time given to us. Number one, the first issue with the book's proposals is one of strategy. The book is missing a discussion of what political strategies and processes are needed to achieve half-Earth socialism. Instead, it presumes the day when the revolution happens, saying, imagine that half-Earth socialist revolution happens tomorrow. Of course, a book that draws a blueprint for a future society does not need to include a strategy. Nevertheless, it's worth asking the authors what they think about this issue. Number two, few would oppose the assertion that creating a just world that fits within ecological constraints is the road of life that humanity must cross in the 21st century. To this end, the co-authors advocate veganism, renewable with energy quotas, and planetary rewilding. These three policies seem to come primarily from a perspective of distributive justice within ecological constraints. However, if today's environmental collapse and inequality is due to the way capitalism works, then we must address the issue of compensatory justice. Even if the compensatory justice is seen as a constitutive of the future rather than a return to the past, it will need to be the basis for realizing distributive justice. For example, in order to realize the 2000 watt society advocated by the authors, the lives of people in the global north must be downsized, and compensatory or historical justice is one of the prerequisites for their acceptance. Number three, regarding Half-Earth project, I think it's a kind of neo-protectionism. There are several issues in this regard. First of all, it still maintains the nature-culture dichotomy. It has been criticized for quite some time that the ruthless exploitation of nature is based on this dichotomy. Furthermore, what does it really mean to protect nature, i.e., to create a kind of cordon center and leave the nature within it untouched? And finally, which areas are specifically protected? For example, indigenous areas, urbanized areas of the global north, etc. Finally, number four, regarding planning, I think it's a great achievement of the authors to revive the methods and experience of concrete planning in the socialist tradition rather than to regret it as the myth of planning. However, I think the problem is how the numerous needs can be allocated. Of course, Drew explains well it, but I think how the numerous needs can be allocated and organized within a society. In other words, on what basis can a society produce, distribute, and consume its general and individual needs? This question also connects to Neurath's critique of shadow universality. I think Neurath's critique of shadow universality is relevant, but can society be organized without anything considered universal? This is my question. This leads to the question of money and markets specifically. Does Harper's socialism work entirely by planning without markets? Or so on. Thank you for listening, and I hope the problems I raised could be the points when we develop and advance the eco-socialist program. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for waking up so early in the morning and giving a presentation. And so I'm a night person. I cannot imagine that you wake up like around 5 and prepare for the presentation for your audience in South Korea. And I really love your idea about the connecting the bottom. And I hope that next time we Korean scholars and activists have some preparation to let you know about the climate politics and climate movement in South Korea, including the power plant workers movement for just transition, something like that. So thank you again so much for your presentation. We really enjoyed your presentation today.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Now we have to wrap up the seminar. As we all fear, we are at the brink of collapse, but we shall not surrender. Quote Winston Churchill in World War II. Eco-socialism generally, Harvard socialism specifically, could be a starting point where we are able to face the challenges of our time and an aim where we should seek to survive. I hope today's discussion could be a newer starting point for advancing our guide and program for an ecological and democratic world. I'd like to thank Drew Pendergrass again for joining the seminar. Thank you.